At the Nocturnus, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
Welcome to another special episode of The Nocturnus, Stories from the World of Medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. As we work on Season 3 of the podcast, we wanted to share a wonderful conversation I recently had in front of a live audience with physician-author Louise Aronson. Louise recently wrote a monumental new book called Elderhood, Redefining Aging, Transforming Medicine, and Reimagining Life. The week leading up to our conversation, I tore through Louise's book, where she shares her personal journey, medical anecdotes, philosophy, research, and a dash of humor to make an urgent case for changing the way we as a society view aging and disease. By the time I finished the book, my perspective on aging had totally transformed. And I'm not alone. Shortly after the book was published, it jumped onto the New York Times bestseller list, and I think this is because its message is so universal. In the age of modern medicine, we're all going to get old, if we're lucky anyway. And that comes with a big set of challenges, which Louise helps us navigate really beautifully in the text. In addition to being a geriatrician at UCSF, Louise is a frequent contributor to CBS This Morning, NPR, and the New York Times. I spoke to her at Podcast Theater at the Beta Brand store in the Mission District of San Francisco. To start, I asked her to read an excerpt from the very beginning of the book.
On a foggy morning in 2015, I arrived at the University of California, Berkeley for an appointment with Professor Guy Miko. I had heard about an exercise he did every fall with his new medical students, and I wanted to see it for myself. Standing at the front of a cramped classroom, Miko asked a group of 16 students to put down the first words that came to mind when he used the word old in reference to a person. "Don't filter," he said, "just right." With his thick white mustache and ring of flyaway hair, Miko bore a vague resemblance to Albert Einstein, an effect compounded over the next 2 hours by his wide-ranging curiosity and distractibility. The young men and women around the single large table were first-year students in a joint medicine public health graduate program that describes its matriculates as, quote, passionately dedicated to improving the world's health. They ranged in age from early to middle 20s, and their resumes attested to extraordinarily idealistic good intentions. The students began scribbling on the scratch paper Miko provided so he could collect responses and assess trends over time. When 1 minute elapsed, he told them to stop, and then he repeated his instructions, but this time with the word elder. A few students shook their heads. They knew they were being manipulated. Miko had been doing this exercise with his students and actually his friends and colleagues for years. The faces in the room changed, but their responses to the two prompts did not. There were no trends reflecting shifts in how his students thought and felt about old age, not yet anyway. So he wasn't surprised when the most common associations with the word old included wrinkled, bent over, slow-moving, bald, and white hair. Many also wrote weak, fragile, feeble, frail, or sick. A sizable minority put down a variation of a grandparent, and several listed their mothers, though generally the parents of medical students range in age from late 40s to early 60s, years most people consider part of middle age. Some used words like wisdom, but more chose sad, pejorative, stubborn, and lonely. One wrote, quote, smelling of mothballs and stale smoke. For elder, the list looked very different. By far the most common word was wise. Other responses were respect, leader, experience, power, money, and knowledge.
Thank you very much. So just to begin, I'd like to ask, how did this book come about?
Ooh, don't know whether to give you the long version or the short version. Well, in some ways it came about because I got a 2-book deal for my first book, and and the editor said, nonfiction would be great. I think you'd be really good at that. And then it actually didn't come about for about 6 years as I did my real job, as I like to call my job at UCSF. But I think it also came about because I began to use my writing as what I think of as an instrument for public health and social change, sort of seducing people not just with facts, not just intellectually, but also emotionally, and that's more likely to make people change their thoughts and behaviors. And so I started accruing a bunch of essays, and then I tried to write it, and I actually wrote one version. I looked up all the successful doctor books, and they all have between 8 and 13 chapters. This is very internist-like of me. 8 and 13 chapters, and each one is about 26 to 35 pages long, and I wrote about 80% of that book, and I just wanted to eat a bullet. Like, I was so bored. So then I walked around and did nothing for 6 months, and I realized I had been writing these funky, very literary essays and doing this, and I realized they were all part of the same book. And then once I had that realization, with help actually from another doctor writer, Victoria Sweet, who was the first one who suggested that, then it just poured.
So we talk a lot about childhood and adulthood, but what is elderhood?
So elderhood is just like childhood and adulthood. It's one of the 3 main phases of life. I mean, we understand that in childhood, you begin as a neonate, then you're an infant, a toddler, a young kid, a tween, a teen, and a young adult, and that's been 20 years. Then we have adults, and we know that 22-year-olds really only very vaguely resemble 62-year-olds, right? And then there's we understand that's all different. But we come up with this thing called old, which sort of begins at variable times. And actually, when we think old begins depends on the age we are when asked that question. Surprise, surprise. But we just lump it all into this singular thing, as if it's the same to be 65 as 85 as 105. And I realized because we didn't have a terminology or a conception, really, we didn't have policies or attitudes that really enabled elderhood in the same way we enable childhood and adulthood. So like in parks, you have the playground areas with all the fun, colorful things to play on. And you have the basketball courts and the baseball diamonds. Where are the places for older and old people to exercise and socialize and do all those same things? They're literally absent. I just realized the only way to transform it was to make it visible. And so every time, now a person can make the argument that every time somebody says we do this for kids and this for adults, you can say, and what do you do for elders?
And you talk a lot in the book about how the medical establishment and also just the government lumps everyone over 65 into this single population that's known as old. And I'd like to hear you talk about what's wrong with that approach and what's a better approach, especially because it seems people age at different rates. As you say in the book, there are 80-year-olds who are, running marathons, and there's also 80-year-olds who are bedbound. So how do we take this 65-plus age group and stratify it further while also accounting for the huge diversity that it contains?
Well, it's definitely a challenge in so many ways. I mean, I think part of why it hasn't existed was because being old was relatively rare for a long time. So I don't want to necessarily say everybody's being evil and ageist. I mean, things change historically and culturally. At the same time, it is sort of complicated, but we know lumping old into a single category flies in the face of biology and social behaviors, et cetera. In geriatrics, we tend to divide it based on function. One of the problems with that as a social option, basically, is that we so degrade people whose function is less than optimal, so that nobody wants to be in the other categories. Like, you don't blame the toddler if they need a diaper, and you don't blame the adolescent, they may annoy you, but if they have emotional incontinence and, really bad judgment and all those things that adolescents are known for. And yet somehow as people get older and move through the very natural changes of a human life, they are blamed for these things. And part of it is, it does feel different, though ethically it is no different, to have something and lose it than not to have it and be moving toward it. But when we devalue old age, we actually devalue everybody who isn't a master athlete or isn't, it's kind of like I talk in the book about what we were taught in my era, and still as I go around the country talking, it still happens, what normal is. And normal is a white heterosexual Christian male between 45 and 25 who's healthy. And that makes almost everyone on the planet abnormal. So I think one of the things we need to do is say I'm old and show what old really looks like. Yes, old is still running your company. Old is telling you you have to go to bed now. Old is, inventing this new app. So I think we need to figure out how we do that best, and also as people move from, senior to old to elderly to aged, we accept that as normal and we don't add judgment to it. It harkens back to that part I read about old and elder, because it turns out if you look up the definitions of those two words, they are identical. So the fact that we think old is bad and elder is good is all about culture and bias that we are bringing to those two words.
What you're saying about normal being the white, heterosexual Christian man between the ages of 40 and 60 or whatever it was reminds me of a day I was in the hospital and we all went down to the echo lab to look at a heart ultrasound of a patient. And it was a woman who was about 85. And we were looking at this ultrasound, and the cardiologist was pointing at the muscle and showing us how it had grown stiff over time. And that was affecting the way the fluid of the blood was moving through the heart muscle. And I turned to him and I said, "Is that normal?" And his response to me was, "I don't know, is a cataract normal?" And that kind of sent me on this existential tailspin. And so as I was reading your book, I really loved the sections that got philosophical, especially the ones where you are trying to tease apart the difference between aging and disease. And there are even sections where you refer to normal aging or pathological aging, or the case of the 95-year-old man with the right knee pain. And the doctor says, "What do you expect? The knee's 95 years old." And he says, "Well, I have the other one and it's fine." So what is the difference between aging and disease?
This is actually one of the things I did for the book was I read a lot of history of old age, which you might think, having been thinking about old age for all these years, I would have, I kept reading these things and thinking, why do we not all read this? Because it's kind of fascinating. Human beings have been asking the same questions about old age forever. Like you go back to the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, the Greeks, the Romans, everybody's asking these questions. So I think by inclination, I'd be liable to say, well, aging isn't a disease, it's part of the natural arc, right? You develop, or so we say, until you're about age 20, and then thereafter you're aging. So then is the thickened heart of an 80-year-old normal? Because most hearts that live that long will be thickened, except that when I was in medical school way back when, in the very early 90s, we were taught that old people's blood pressure went up because old people's blood pressure went up. And so that made sense. And we said, well, if they're middle-aged, you lower it. And if they're older, that's just normal. Well, then it turned out that, old people's blood pressure goes up. And if you let it stay up, they have strokes, just the same as the middle-aged people, right? So now we actually treat old people's blood pressure, too. So you're kind of stuck. Then are we calling much of a person's existence pathological? And so maybe the problem is that we define old people exclusively by their bodies, and we define human beings at other stages by more than their bodies. But these are some of the things I'm thinking about.
One aspect of geriatrics I'm interested in is the fact that a lot of the studies that we have in medicine that we apply to our patients were actually never studied on older adults. And so when you're thinking about prescribing medications, even simple ones like aspirin, we actually either don't know or aren't educated about how those particular medications affect older adults or aged people. Can you speak a little bit to this, kind of the exclusion of this patient population from clinical trials and how that bears out in the clinical setting?
Well, the earliest clinical trials were done by, physician researchers in their image, which meant that they basically did trials on white men, between the ages of 30 and 60 or whatever. And that wasn't necessarily malevolent. In science, you always try and get rid of noise, things that will influence the outcome. And if you have, for example, men and women, they have different hormones in their bodies, they have different life experiences, so then it kind of muddies the data. 20 and 30 years ago, the National Institutes of Health, so the biggest research funder traditionally in this country, said, hey, it turns out we're getting a lot of information that when we say women are different than men, and then we study a disease in men only, and we apply the results to women, the women don't do very well. So we're thinking maybe we should include women, and the same goes for children and people of color. But inclusion criteria for people over the age of 65, the NIH did finally pass a rule in 2019. It happened earlier this year. So that's how much old people are just not considered. So that's really harmed us, because then you apply the results to a population you said, hey, they're harder to study. They have more other problems. It gets much more confusing, and then they have bad outcomes. But in the case of old people, what would happen? They'd say, oh, well, she was old and sick. So we see this a lot. Now, there are places where we have good data for this. For example, drug reactions. Old people are far more likely than other populations to be hospitalized for drug reactions. And it extends to over-the-counter drugs. Really simple drugs like basic pain relievers, basic sleep medicines, cold medicines can do really bad things as we age. And we geriatricians tell most people over the age of 70 never to take any of those medicines. And yet, if you look at those medicines, they will have precautions for children, for pregnant people, for people with certain medical conditions. And it would be fine if you only did medical conditions, but the fact that you've done children and pregnant women means that you have a population-based approach. Yet the population we have abundant data on harm to, they don't actually include. And that's disappointing, would be a word. One among many, one could choose.
Some hospitals have invented this concept of the ACE unit, and ACE stands for Acute Care for Elders. We actually have an ACE unit at San Francisco General Hospital, which is where I work. And when I got to the section in your book where you were going to talk about the ACE unit, I got really excited, and I thought, here's an intervention that's going to work really well. We'll have these geriatrician experts in dialogue with the hospitalists to provide their expertise and help guide our management in patients who are older. But then as the chapter unfolded, I was just horrified by your experience in the ACE unit. And I was wondering if you could share with our audience what your experience was and maybe what that reflects about non-geriatrician physicians' attitudes about older patients or about geriatricians.
Okay, so where to begin with this? I think I'll begin with a bit of a caveat, which is that our ACE unit had just started, and then the person who has actually done all the hard work to bring it to our main medical center and also now make it a success was out of the country when I began. So I showed up, and nobody really wanted the consults. Like, they were complaining about the older patients, and yet when you tried to help, like one person I went in to see, and she was having a stroke. So, like the admitting note said, this leg moves this way, and I'm having the leg is not moving, and that was what she was admitted for anyway. She'd had a TIA the previous day. So I called the hospitalist, and I called a code stroke and things like that, and I said, I'll help, and she just was like, get out of my way, she would not even talk to me. We were consulted by a really distressed nurse on another patient who had been in the hospital for 5 months. Literally looked like where you see people in countries that have had famine for years, or people in concentration camps, like curled up, bones jutting in a bed, every organ system failing, except for the kidneys were newly failed, and so they were going to try dialysis. But from the doorway, this was a person who was dying and who had been dying. And so I called the attending and I said, people on the floor are kind of disturbed, and, what can you tell me what you're thinking? And they were saying, well, it's at least worth a try. And worth a try is something we hear a lot. Worth a try. I would think, like, ideally a patient would get to choose that also, but worth a try, like in this situation, the only thing that might have gotten a little better was the kidneys. Right, so the brain wasn't working, and the body wasn't working, and the liver wasn't working so well, and the lungs weren't working so well, and the heart wasn't working so well, and and people want to try things because they're available, and because so often in medicine we're taught the point of medicine is to save lives. And to the extent that that was ever true, it was true sort of briefly in the 20th century. I also looked through the history of medicine. The point of medicine, well, then this also brings up the difference between medicine and healthcare. So healthcare is actually to preserve health, but in this country, 97% of our healthcare dollars go towards medicine, and very little goes towards health. About 70% of health is social determinants of health. So things like housing and food and all these other things we don't pay for or prioritize, and a lot of the prevention we could do to keep people from getting sick. Medicine comes in where you're sick, and we've actually created a system where letting people get sick so that we can come in and do expensive things, expensive drugs to them, is basically our modus operandi, and that's probably why we're ranked 37th internationally for health outcomes. So I'm on the ACE unit, and I just keep seeing these things, where people are being hurt, and the team's like, well, let's just give it a couple of days. And of course that person died, and the family came in and were appalled at what the person looked like. So I just I just felt like there was this cultural divide that was beyond anything. And we do have a different approach. I didn't quite answer your question earlier, where, yes, we know all about the older bodies, but we also look at things differently. We look at the amalgam of health issues. We think a lot about function. So who is this person in the world, and what does he or she want to do, right? What do they need to do, or what do they care about in their lives? What is the life expectancy? Because if you have 20 more years, a bad year may be worth it. If you have 20 more months, it may be, you may want to think about that longer. Some people will pick yes and some people will pick no. But if you don't have the right conversation with them, they're not going to pick what's right for them. And if you have 20 more weeks, then you have a whole other conversation. So I think it's just a really different approach. And I found the cultural difference really jarring. And then I thought, was I this callous? And there was also this young patient crying in pain from widely metastatic cancer like every morning when I got there. I just thought and everybody would walk by. And I thought, I don't want to become a person who can walk by.
I'm reminded of a recent case I heard about in the hospital, a very difficult case that affected, I think, a lot of people emotionally in the hospital, a person in their 90s who was having a heart attack. And the decision was whether or not to give them a blood thinner. It was actually several blood thinners, which is the normal treatment for a heart attack. And thinking about the pros and cons of this intervention, ultimately the decision was made to give the blood thinners, and the patient suffered a bad side effect. And it was then reminding me of a doctor I worked with in medical school, Dr. Thomas Finucane, who I know you're familiar with his work at Johns Hopkins. And I remember going to his profile on the Johns Hopkins website one day, and there's a section that says academic interests. And most people, it's about tuberculosis or HIV or whatever. And his said, preventing the overtreatment of the frail and elderly. And then underneath it said, preventing the undertreatment of the frail and elderly. And I was thinking about this case and the blood thinners, because on the one hand, you don't want to be too aggressive and overtreat like you're describing, but on the other hand, you don't want to feel ageist and not offer an intervention simply because of somebody's age. And so,
can I ask what questions were asked about the person?
It was in the context of a public going through the case. So it was an audience.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah, and I wasn't actually interfacing with the patient and their family, so it was hard to tell. As you know, in some of these case conferences, the psychosocial dimension of care is often left out, which may also just be a symptom of the larger problem we're talking about.
To me, it might make a big difference if it was a 90-year-old who'd been, losing weight, barely eating, living in a nursing home for 2 years and hadn't spoken in 1 year, versus it's a 95-year-old living alone, runs the local movie club, goes walking every day with their friends. I mean, this is where a geriatrician comes in and thinks differently. Who is this person? And also, is there an advance directive or someone who understands his or her values for life, what risks he or she would take or not? And I wouldn't even, blood thinners, okay, we all know the pros and cons. That's not the issue for me as the geriatrician. I need to know about this patient, or I cannot make the decision. The decision for me never has to do with the disease. It has to do with the human being.
I think that's a great answer. And I think this approach that you're talking about is one that we see a lot in palliative care, geriatrics, one might even venture to say primary care. And in your book, you talk a lot about healthcare disparities, and I think we all know and talk a lot about the fact that healthcare is not as good for people who are Black and brown and for people who have lower income. But you bring up this whole other concept of health disparities, which is health disparities within medicine at the level of medical specialties. So palliative care, geriatrics, primary care, not getting as much research and devotion as other specialties. Can you speak a little bit to these health disparities within medical specialties? Why, you have a great quote. You say, in medicine, some specialties are tops while others are bottoms.
I don't remember writing that line. Sounds more provocative than I remember.
Can you tell us what you mean by this?
Well, I guess my point in doing this was not to like, woe are the poor doctors who are starving on the streets, just to be totally clear about that. Like, we all get perfectly decent salaries in a world with lots of injustice. On the other hand, we need to put our money where our values are. And maybe we have, and they're just not where my values are. I think if you narrow somebody down to one part, sometimes that's absolutely essential. I'm not saying we don't need specialists and subspecialists, but in some ways that makes it easier. It's much harder and more complicated to have to think about how the parts and the diseases and the medications interact, to consider how they interact with the person's socioeconomic status or other opportunities. And a lot of people, younger internists like you, go into hospital medicine now. I mean, you're either on or you're off. In primary care, you're always on. You have responsibility during the time you're on, and then you send people out onto the world. And yet, hospitalists who are trained in the same way as outpatient internists are paid thousands, tens of thousands of dollars more each year for a job that one could argue is critically important and by no means easy, but the people who are doing the stuff, everybody says that's too hard, like that's too much of an invasion on my life. Like, the people doing all of that are the people we pay the least. The people taking care of our kids and our elders and the people who are mentally ill are the ones we pay the least. I mean, there is this ongoing prejudice. In fact, there was a study that a lot of people were talking about on Twitter and other places yesterday about grant funding from the NIH. And it turned out Black applicants were less likely to get grants than white applicants. And part of that was because Black applicants were more likely to be working on population and community level issues, and white applicants were more likely to be working on disease or organ issues. So this pervades, what science we get, what opportunities people have, and it speaks to a set of values that I think do us disservice as individuals and as a society.
I think what you're saying about values is really important, because I think all of us would want to be treated as a whole person. Nobody wants to be treated like a machine with replaceable parts, and yet somehow the incentive structure is completely misaligned. I wonder if that just has to do with prejudice, like you're saying, or if it has to do with, well, actually, this is just the easier track, or this is more glamorous, or this is more...
I think some of it is historical. So the new things of the 20th century that really did transform medicine and have been amazing. And they're actually why we have an elderhood that is several decades longer than it used to be. So, absolute credit where credit is due. And those things were really exciting, and they were new, and so they got paid more. But now what we're learning is, you treat those acute issues, and what you end up is a population full of people with chronic problems and full of aging people. And it's interesting that we still give grants now for things that will save lives, but in those grants there is no accountability for, and then what's going to happen to those lives, and what's going to happen to the planet if no one dies. I mean, we have these huge institutes, I talk about this here, big projects that fund, our own institution has these billboards all over town about what would happen if we eradicated disease. Well, okay, so nobody gets sick, so then we just murder each other? Because if you look at human history, that is the most likely outcome, and then that's going to be also, the planet, the decline of the planet is accelerated, and yet people are still allowed to do this kind of science without having to do any of the ethical or social implications. And I really think grants need to be divided equally to be more responsible. I think there's one more factor, and it's sort of historical too, but at the risk of reducing us all to binary genders and stereotypes, there traditionally have been certain activities that men do more of, and there have traditionally been certain activities that women do more of. And if you look at what gets paid more, it is the technical, instrumental, et cetera, things that are more aligned with men. And if you look at what gets paid less, it is the caring, relational, interrelational, cognitive things that women have traditionally done more of. So I think that's probably not coincidence for, until the 1990s, basically women were all pushed into psychiatry or pediatrics.
So this is a quotation that I love from writer Anne Lamott. And she says, "Our true person is outside of space and time. But looking at the paperwork, I can in fact see that I was born in 1954. My inside self is outside of time and space. It doesn't have an age. I'm every age I've ever been, and so are you." And what I loved about this quote is that for a long time, I used to think about age as a subtraction, things that we lose, function, ability, family, friends. But this quote really felt to me like an expansiveness. And so I wanted to end on a positive note and just ask you, I think we all know what we lose as we age, but what do we gain?
Such a good question. We gain a lot. And this also speaks to the old elder, where we tend to tell one story of old age and not the whole story. So what people find in in huge studies across populations and nations, with the exception of the very poorest poor, who remain miserable at all ages. People tend to be relatively happy as children, and then sometimes in their 20s it kind of goes down and anxiety goes way up. So life satisfaction and happiness goes down in adulthood. Anxiety goes way up. And then as people get into their later 50s and early 60s, it reverses. Anxiety goes down and happiness and life satisfaction go right up. And that's interesting because that's the moment where you're beginning to accumulate losses, right, and lost opportunities. One of the ways I think about it is, we say when we're young we have so many opportunities, but the fact is we only pick a handful of them. So there's 100,000. You don't do 100,000 different things. You do a few different things. And in some ways, and maybe this is just who I am, but I think there is an ease to having fewer options. The people who thrive in old age think not about the options they don't have, but about picking among the options they do have, the ones that are best suited to them and going after them wholeheartedly. What I've seen in patients aligns perfectly with what I read in the data, which is that you know who you are, you know what matters, and you're better at prioritizing your time towards what matters. And then lastly, we know the people who do that really have pretty, happy old ages until, bad things happen, because bad things do happen. That part is true too. But I'll just add one last thing, which is that we also tend to divorce healthy aging from the aging that requires care. And in so doing, we create the very old age that we fear most. So I think one of the most important things is to remember that no matter how old or how frail, that is a human being. And like Anne Lamott, when that person looks in the mirror, they are surprised to see an old person. They feel just like their same person. Everyone I've ever taken care of says the same thing, and I begin to feel the same way. You feel just like yourself. So that's a human being, and I think the most important thing we can do is recognize and appreciate and treat human beings of all ages like human beings. It's not like an extra standard, it's just like a baseline.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening to this special episode of The Nocturnist. If you'd like to support us as we work on Season 3, visit us at thenocturnist.com. We have options there for donation and sponsorship. This episode of The Nocturnist was produced by Liza Veal. I also want to thank our executive producer, Allie Block, Head of Story Development, Adelaide Papazzolo. Sound Engineer, Alberto Hernandez. Director of Communications, Chloe Lassard. And our fundraising lead, Cecilia Peterson. I'm Emily Silverman. Take care and see you next time.